You don't get to break someone just because you're afraid of being broken. The rain fell in thin, relentless lines across the glass walls of Reed Industries, turning the city beyond into a blur of silver and shadow, and inside, under the cold white lights of the executive floor, Jonathan Reed stood perfectly still, his jaw tight, his gaze locked on something far below, as if the entire world had just slipped out of his control. Hours earlier, that same man had stood at the head of a polished conference table, voice sharp, measured, and unforgiving, dismantling a young employee's presentation with surgical precision, every word chosen not just to correct but to cut, and Sophie Bennett had stood there, hands clasped in front of her, shoulders straight despite the sting, her voice soft but steady as she accepted every critique without flinching, without fighting back, as if dignity was the only thing she refused to surrender. To Jonathan, it had been just another meeting. Another necessary correction in a world where weakness cost millions, where trust was a liability he had buried years ago, but to everyone else in that room, it had been something harder to watch, the quiet kind of cruelty that didn't raise its voice but lingered long after the words were gone. Sophie had left the room with the same calm expression she walked in with, gathering her notes, offering a polite nod, disappearing into the hallway where the hum of printers and distant conversations swallowed her whole. And Jonathan had already moved on, issuing orders, shifting numbers, controlling outcomes like he always did, because control was the only language he trusted. But control had limits, and he was about to learn that the hard way, because now, standing high above the city with rain streaking the glass, he wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or board approvals, he was thinking about her, about the way she never argued, never pushed back, never gave him the reaction he expected. And that silence had started to echo louder than any confrontation. His phone buzzed. In his hand, ignored, the world waiting for his next command while he remained frozen, replaying a moment he couldn't undo. A moment from just minutes ago, when he had stepped out onto the street, intending to head to his car, his mind still running through numbers and strategies, until he saw her, not in the office, not under fluorescent lights, but across the street beneath a small awning, her hair slightly damp from the rain, her face different somehow, softer, alive in a way he had never seen before, and she was smiling, not the polite, guarded smile she wore at work, but something real, something unguarded, and she wasn't alone. The man standing beside her leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice, his hand briefly brushing hers as he passed her a cup of coffee, and Sophie laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that cut through the noise of the city and landed somewhere deep in Jonathan's chest, somewhere he hadn't felt anything in a long time. He should have walked away, should have dismissed it as none of his concern, because she was just an employee. Because her life outside those office walls had nothing to do with him, but his feet didn't move, his breath caught, and something unfamiliar, sharp and uninvited, twisted beneath his ribs. He watched as she thanked the man, as their shoulders brushed, as she looked at him like he mattered, and for the first time in years, Jonathan Reed felt something dangerously close to losing control. Because the one person he thought he had completely figured out suddenly belonged to a world he couldn't reach, and the realization hit harder than anything he had ever said to her, because it wasn't just jealousy, it was the quiet, terrifying understanding that he had been pushing away something real without even knowing it, and now, standing there with the rain falling and the city moving on without him, he couldn't shake the one thought that refused to leave, the one that echoed louder with every passing second. He had never wanted her attention, until it was no longer his to command. By the time Jonathan finally tore his gaze away from the street, the rain had already soaked through the shoulders of his tailored coat, but he barely noticed, because the image of Sophie standing there, smiling so easily at someone else, refused to leave his mind. It followed him into the elevator, into the quiet hum of the underground garage, and all the way back up to his office where the city lights flickered against the glass like distant signals he could not decode, and for the first time in years, the numbers on his screen blurred together, meaningless, unimportant, because none of them explained why that moment had unsettled him so deeply. He set his phone down harder than necessary, exhaling slowly as if forcing himself back into control. But control did not come as easily as it used to, not when every thought circled back to her, to the way she had looked at that man, to the quiet warmth in her expression that he had never seen directed at him, and the realization sat heavy in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. The next morning, the office felt exactly the same as it always did: polished floors, muted conversations, the steady rhythm of ambition moving through every department. Yet something had shifted, at least for him, because when Sophie walked in, holding her usual stack of files, her posture composed, her expression neutral, he noticed everything: the slight crease in her sleeve, the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the way she greeted the receptionist with a soft smile before stepping into the elevator, and it was a level of attention he had never given her before. Not really. The meeting started at 9 sharp. And when her turn came to present again, she stood at the front of the room with the same quiet confidence, her voice steady, her ideas clear, and for a brief moment, Jonathan said nothing, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than usual, as if testing himself. But old habits returned quickly, sharp and instinctive, and he interrupted her mid-sentence, pointing out flaws, questioning her assumptions, pushing harder than necessary, because that was who he had always been. And yet this time, something felt different, because she did not shrink under it, she did not rush to apologize or retreat into silence. Instead she met his gaze, calm but firm, and adjusted her explanation without losing her ground. The room shifted subtly, the tension changing shape, and Jonathan felt it. That small, undeniable shift, like a crack forming in something he had built carefully over years, and he did not like it. After the meeting, as people filed out, he called her name, his tone controlled, but there was an edge beneath it that he could not quite hide, and she turned back, waiting, her expression composed, giving nothing away, and for a moment he hesitated, searching for the right words, something professional, something detached, but what came out instead was sharper, more personal than he intended, asking about her performance, about her focus, about whether something outside of work was distracting her. And the question hung there between them, heavier than it should have been. Sophie held his gaze for a second longer than expected, her eyes steady, unreadable, and then she answered simply, that her work was exactly where it needed to be, and if there was nothing else, she had deadlines to meet. And she turned to leave before he could respond, her calm dismissal cutting deeper than any argument could have. Jonathan stood there, watching the door close behind her, the silence settling back into the room. But it did not feel like control anymore. It felt like something slipping just out of reach, something he could not command, and the more he tried to push it away, the clearer it became that whatever he had seen the night before had not been a passing moment, it had been a line, and somehow, without realizing it, he had already crossed it. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm that should have felt familiar, meetings stacked back to back, decisions made in seconds, voices rising and falling in carefully measured tones, but for Jonathan, every moment carried a quiet distraction he could not shake, because no matter how many times he redirected his focus to the work in front of him, his attention drifted back to her. To the unanswered question that lingered beneath every interaction, and by late afternoon, it had settled into something sharper, something that refused to be ignored. Across the office floor, Sophie moved with the same quiet efficiency she always had, reviewing documents, answering calls, coordinating with her team, and if anyone else noticed a difference, they did not show it. But Jonathan saw it now in a way he never had before, the way she stayed behind after others left, the way she took on extra work without complaint, the way she offered help before it was asked for, and each small detail built on the last until it formed a picture he could not easily dismiss. Near 6:30, as the office began to empty, Jonathan stepped out of his office and paused, his eyes scanning the floor until they found her again, seated at her desk, a soft lamp casting a warm circle of light over the papers in front of her, her shoulders slightly tense but her focus unbroken, and for a moment, he simply watched, unseen, trying to understand something that should have been simple but no longer was. Then her phone buzzed, and the shift was immediate, her expression softening in a way he recognized from the night before, that same quiet warmth, that same ease. And she answered with a gentle tone, speaking in low, careful words that he could not fully hear but could somehow still feel, and when she smiled, it was not the polite smile she gave colleagues or the controlled expression she wore in meetings, It was real, unguarded, and it stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to frustration. He turned away before she could notice him, stepping back into his office, closing the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing briefly in the quiet space. And he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as if trying to physically push the thoughts away, but they remained, persistent, unwanted, and growing. Minutes later, he found himself at the window again, the city stretching out beneath him, lights blinking on as dusk settled in, and without fully deciding to, he reached for his phone, scrolling through internal records, stopping when her name appeared, Sophie Bennett, her profile simple, efficient, unremarkable on paper. Just another employee in a company filled with them, but now it felt incomplete, as if the facts failed to capture something essential. He hesitated for a moment, then closed the file, the action abrupt, almost defensive, because whatever this was, it was not something he could reduce to data or control through information, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else had. When he stepped out of his office again, the floor was nearly empty, and Sophie was gathering her things, slipping papers into her bag, her movements unhurried, and without thinking, he called her name again, his voice cutting through the quiet, and she paused, turning to face him, waiting. Her expression neutral but not closed, and for a brief moment either of them spoke. The silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate. Then he asked if she was leaving early, the question coming out sharper than intended, and she answered simply that her work was done for the day, that she had somewhere she needed to be, and there was something in the way she said it, calm, certain, that made it clear she was not asking for permission, and something in Jonathan tightened in response. A reflex he did not fully understand. He nodded once, dismissing her with a brief comment about tomorrow's schedule, but as she turned and walked toward the elevator, he found himself watching again, the distance between them suddenly more noticeable than it had ever been, and when the elevator doors closed, taking her out of sight, the silence that followed did not feel like control, it felt like absence, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Reed realized that there was something in his life he could not command, something he did not understand, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more it demanded to be seen. That night, the city did not offer Jonathan the distraction it usually did, not the steady hum of traffic below his penthouse windows, not the quiet glow of skyline lights stretching for miles, not even the familiar routine he had built his life around, because every attempt to return to normal only made one thing clearer, that something inside him had shifted and refused to settle back into place. He poured himself a glass of water, set it down untouched, and moved restlessly through the open space, his thoughts circling back to the same image again and again, Sophie standing beneath that awning, smiling in a way he had never allowed her to in his presence, and the more he replayed it, the more it felt less like coincidence and more like something he had been blind to all along. By morning, the tension had not faded, it had sharpened, turning into a quiet urgency that followed him into the office earlier than usual, long before most employees had arrived, and he found himself standing on the empty floor, looking out over the rows of desks as if expecting answers to appear where there had only ever been routine. When Sophie finally walked in, just after 8, she paused briefly when she noticed him already there, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it disappeared behind the same composed expression she always wore, and she greeted him politely, as she always did, before moving to her desk, setting down her bag and immediately beginning her work, as if nothing had changed, as if the distance between them was still exactly what it had always been. But to Jonathan, it did not feel the same, not anymore, and before he could stop himself, he crossed the floor toward her, his steps measured but deliberate, and when he reached her desk, she looked up, waiting, her calm presence almost disarming in its steadiness, and for a moment, he hesitated again, searching for the right way to frame what he wanted to say without exposing the uncertainty he was trying to hide. He asked about the project timeline, about her workload, about whether she needed additional support, questions that sounded professional, but carried something else beneath them, something she seemed to notice even if she did not acknowledge it directly, because her answers were brief, precise, and carefully neutral, offering no more than necessary, and it struck him then, with quiet clarity, that this was how she had always responded, not because she lacked anything to say, but because she had learned not to offer more than what was required. The realization lingered as he returned to his office, closing the door behind him, and, for the first time, the silence inside that space felt heavier than it ever had before, not like control, but like consequence. Throughout the morning, he watched the office in ways he never had, noticing how Sophie interacted with others, how she listened fully when someone spoke, how she gave her attention without hesitation, how she remained patient even when others were not, and each observation chipped away at the version of her he had constructed in his mind, replacing it with something more real, something harder to dismiss. Then, just after noon, he saw it again, the same shift from the night before, her phone lighting up, her expression softening, her posture relaxing in a way that seemed almost instinctive, and without thinking, he stepped out of his office, his gaze fixed on her as she stepped away from her desk to take the call in the hallway, her voice low, her tone gentle, and though he could not hear the words, he recognized the feeling, the connection, the ease, and it unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. When she returned, she caught his gaze for a brief second, and something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not understanding, but awareness. And she looked away first, returning to her work without comment, leaving him standing there with a question he could no longer ignore, because whatever place he held in her world, it was not the one he had assumed, and the more he tried to define it, the more it slipped beyond his control, forcing him to face something he had avoided for years, that not everything could be managed, not everything could be owned, and not everything would wait for him to figure it out. By late afternoon, the air inside Reed Industries carried a tension that no one could quite name, but everyone seemed to feel, subtle in the way voices lowered just slightly when Jonathan walked past, in the way glances lingered a second longer than usual, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of the office, and at the center of it, whether he wanted it or not, was him. He had tried to bury himself in work again, pushing through contracts, meetings, and decisions with the same precision that had built his empire, but the discipline that once came effortlessly now felt strained, like forcing order onto something that no longer responded the way it used to, and every time his focus slipped, it returned to the same place, the same unanswered question that had grown louder with every passing hour. Across the floor, Sophie remained steady, consistent, moving through her responsibilities with quiet efficiency, but now Jonathan noticed the moments in between, the pauses when she would glance at her phone, the faint shift in her expression when a message appeared, the small, almost imperceptible exhale before she returned to work. And each detail added weight to something he could no longer dismiss. As coincidence, just before 6, as the office began to thin out again, Jonathan stepped out once more, his steps slower this time, less certain, and he saw her standing near the window, her silhouette framed against the fading light, her phone in her hand, her voice low and gentle as she spoke, and though he could not hear the words, he did not need to, because the tone alone carried meaning, connection, something personal. Something that did not belong to him. When she ended the call, she stayed there for a moment, looking out at the city, her expression thoughtful, almost distant, and something about that stillness drew him closer before he had fully decided to move, his presence quiet but deliberate as he stopped a few feet away. And when she turned, she did not seem surprised this time, only calm, aware, as if she had already expected him to be there. He asked, more directly than before, if everything was all right, the question simple on the surface but carrying a weight he could not hide, and she studied him for a brief moment before answering, her voice even, that everything was fine, that she was just finishing up for the day, and there was a finality in her tone that should have ended the conversation, but instead, it pulled something else out of him, something sharper, less controlled. He asked about the man, the one she had been with the night before, the words coming out more abruptly than intended. And for the first time since he had known her, Sophie did not respond immediately, her expression shifting, not to anger, not to surprise, but to something more guarded, more deliberate, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady but firm, asking him why that mattered. The question lingered between them, simple and direct, and Jonathan realized he did not have an answer he could give without exposing something he was not ready to admit. and that hesitation, brief but undeniable, changed the balance of the moment. Sophie nodded slightly, as if understanding more than he had said, and she told him that her personal life had never interfered with her work, and it never would. Her tone respectful but clear, drawing a line that had never been there before, and then she added, almost gently, that not everything needed to be controlled or evaluated, that sometimes things just existed outside of expectations, and with that she stepped past him, gathering her things, leaving him standing there with words he could not quite form. As the elevator doors closed behind her once again, Jonathan remained still, the quiet of the office settling around him. But it did not feel like silence anymore, it felt like distance, and for the first time, he understood that whatever he had been trying to reach, whatever he had been trying to define, was already moving beyond him, and no amount of control could pull it back within his grasp. That night, the silence in Jonathan's penthouse felt heavier than it ever had before, pressing in from every corner of the glass walls as the city stretched endlessly beyond him, alive with movement he could not connect to, and for once, he did not turn on the television, did not open his laptop, did not reach for the usual distractions that had always kept his thoughts in line, because none of them would have mattered anyway. Instead, he stood there, staring out at the skyline, replaying Sophie's words over and over. Not everything needed to be controlled, not everything existed to be evaluated, and the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it challenged something fundamental in him, something he had built his entire life around. For years, control had been his foundation, the thing that kept everything from falling apart. The thing that ensured no one got close enough to disappoint him, to leave, to prove that trust was a risk not worth taking. But now, standing there alone, he began to question whether that same control had cost him something he had not realized he wanted until it was already slipping away. The next morning came too quickly, and when Jonathan walked into the office, there was a quiet determination in his steps that had not been there before, not the sharp, commanding energy people were used to, but something more measured, more deliberate. As if he was trying to move through unfamiliar ground without fully knowing the rules. Sophie was already there, seated at her desk, her focus on the screen in front of her, her posture composed, and when she noticed him, she offered the same polite greeting she always had, nothing more, nothing less, and that distance, that unchanged formality, made something tighten in his chest again, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand, that whatever he had been feeling, whatever had shifted inside him, had not changed anything for her. He approached her desk, slower this time, less certain, and when she looked up, he hesitated just long enough to feel it, that unfamiliar pause where control used to be, and then he did something he had not done in a long time. He spoke without authority, without correction, without expectation. He asked if she had a few minutes to talk, his voice steady but lacking the edge it once carried. Sophie studied him briefly, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded, standing and following him into a small conference room nearby, the door closing softly behind them, the space quiet and neutral, stripped of the usual hierarchy that defined their interactions. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Jonathan realized how unprepared he was for this, how unfamiliar it felt to stand in front of someone without a clear objective, without a strategy, and that realization alone was enough to unsettle him. But he did not step back this time. Instead, he took a breath and said what he could, that he might have been too harsh, that his expectations had crossed a line, that he had not taken the time to actually see the work she was doing, and the words felt heavier than any decision he had ever made, because they were not about numbers or outcomes, they were about something personal, something real. Sophie listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, and when he finished, she did not immediately accept or reject what he had said. She simply held that moment, as if weighing it, as if deciding what it meant beyond the words themselves, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength in it that had always been there. She said that respect was not something that could be offered once and expected to fix everything, that it was something built over time, through actions, not just words, and while she appreciated the acknowledgement, it did not erase what had already been done. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing that, not resisting it, not trying to argue, because for once, He understood that this was not something he could solve in a single conversation, not something he could control or accelerate. And as they stood there in the quiet room, he realized that whatever came next would not be about authority or position. It would be about something far more uncertain, something he had avoided for years, and for the first time, he did not turn away from it. The days that followed did not transform overnight. There was no sudden shift that erased what had been said or undone what had been felt. Instead, everything moved forward in a slower, more deliberate rhythm, one that demanded patience in a way Jonathan had never practiced before, and for the first time, he allowed that pace to exist without trying to force it into something faster. In meetings, his tone changed, not dramatically. Not enough for everyone to immediately notice, but enough that those who paid attention could feel the difference. The sharp edges softened, the interruptions less frequent, and when Sophie spoke, he listened fully, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as if her words carried weight on their own, and that shift, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed by her. She did not react openly, did not acknowledge it with gratitude or approval, but there was a slight change in how she responded. A fraction more openness, a pause before she spoke as if considering something new, and it was small, almost invisible to anyone else, but to Jonathan, it felt like progress measured in inches rather than miles. Outside of meetings, he began to see more of what he had overlooked before, the way Sophie stayed late not out of obligation but out of commitment, the way she helped a junior employee refine a report without taking credit, the way she quietly corrected errors that could have caused larger issues. And each of these moments reinforced something he had only started to understand, that strength did not always demand attention. Sometimes it simply existed, steady and consistent, regardless of who noticed. One evening, as the office emptied once again, Jonathan found himself standing near the break room, something he had never done before, watching as Sophie poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements slow, her shoulders slightly heavier than usual, and without the structure of a meeting or a formal setting. The distance between them felt different, less defined by roles and more by choice. He stepped forward, offering a simple question about her day, and she answered without hesitation, her tone neutral but not closed, and for a few moments, the conversation remained easy, unforced, drifting from work to small, ordinary details that neither of them would have considered important before, and it was in that simplicity that Jonathan felt something shift again, something quieter this time. Less about control and more about presence. Then, as if reminding him of the line that still existed, her phone buzzed again, and he saw it, that same change, the softness in her expression, the brief smile that appeared without effort, and though he said nothing, did nothing to interrupt, the feeling returned, sharper now, more defined, but instead of reacting, instead of letting it turn into frustration, he held it there, acknowledging it without acting on it, a restraint that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Later that night, as he reviewed a set of reports in his office, his attention caught on something he had not seen before, a reimbursement request filed under Sophie's name, modest in amount but consistent over time, connected to medical expenses that were not hers, and for a moment, he stared at the numbers, the pattern forming slowly, revealing something he had never asked about, never considered, and the realization settled quietly, that there were parts of her life he knew nothing about, parts that existed beyond his assumptions, beyond his control, and for the first time, instead of pushing further, instead of digging for answers, he closed the file. Leaning back in his chair as he looked out over the city, understanding that whatever truth existed behind that pattern, it was not his to uncover by force, and that if he wanted to be part of her world in any meaningful way, it would not come from authority or curiosity alone, it would come from something far more difficult, something he was only just beginning to learn how to give. The following week unfolded with a quiet intensity that neither of them acknowledged but both seemed to feel, a subtle shift in the air that turned ordinary moments into something more deliberate, more meaningful, as if every interaction now carried weight beyond the surface. Jonathan no longer searched for control in the way he once had. Instead, he paid attention, not to outcomes or efficiency, but to the small human details he had spent years overlooking, and in doing so, he began to understand just how much he had missed. One afternoon, as a late meeting ran longer than expected, The office floor gradually emptied until only a handful of lights remained on, casting long shadows across the desks, and when Jonathan stepped out of the conference room, he saw Sophie still there, seated at her desk, her focus unwavering despite the hour, and without thinking, he walked over, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something closer to intention. He asked if she had eaten, the question simple, almost out of place, and she looked up, clearly surprised, her expression softening just slightly before she answered that she had not, that she had planned to finish a few things first, and there was no complaint in her voice, no attempt to draw attention to the effort she was putting in, just a quiet acceptance of what needed to be done. Jonathan nodded once, then did something that would have felt impossible just days before. He told her to take a break, not as an order, but as a suggestion, and when she hesitated, he added that the work would still be there in an hour, but she might not have the same energy to finish it if she did not pause now, and something in his tone must have carried sincerity, because after a brief moment, she agreed, standing and gathering her things, and together they walked out of the building into the cool evening air, the city alive around them in a way that felt different from the isolation of the office. They stopped at a small cafe across the street, nothing extravagant, just a quiet place with warm lighting and the faint sound of music in the background, and for the first time, their conversation moved beyond the boundaries of work without hesitation, not forced, not cautious, but natural, as if the distance between them had shifted just enough to allow something new to form. Sophie spoke about her schedule, about balancing responsibilities that extended far beyond the office, and though she did not go into detail, there was enough there for Jonathan to begin to see the outline of a life that required more strength than he had ever given her credit for, and instead of asking questions that would push further than she was willing to go, he listened, really listened, absorbing each word without trying to shape it into something else. At one point, her phone buzzed again, and for a brief second, the familiar softness returned to her expression, but this time, she did not step away. She simply glanced at the screen, sent a quick reply, and placed the phone back on the table, her attention returning fully to the moment, and something about that choice, small as it was, felt significant. Later, as they stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in the glass around them, Sophie paused, her gaze thoughtful. And she said quietly that people were not always what they seemed at first, that sometimes it took time to see who they really were. And Jonathan understood that the words were not just a reflection, they were a bridge, an acknowledgement of something changing between them. He nodded, not with certainty, but with acceptance, because he knew now that whatever this was becoming, it was not something he could force, not something he could define too quickly, but something that had to be built carefully, honestly. And as they stood there for a moment longer before parting ways, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about control or outcomes, he was thinking about possibility. And that alone was enough to tell him that everything was already different. The weeks that followed did not rush toward a dramatic ending, they unfolded quietly, steadily, like something being rebuilt with care instead of force, and in that space, something real began to take shape between them, not defined by titles or expectations, but by the choices they made each day. Jonathan no longer measured his success by control alone, he measured it in moments he once would have overlooked. In the way he listened before speaking, in the way he allowed others to be seen, without immediately judging their worth, and nowhere was that change more evident than in how he treated Sophie, not as someone beneath his authority, but as someone whose presence carried its own value. One morning, during a board meeting that carried more weight than most, a senior executive questioned a proposal Sophie had worked on, dismissing it with a tone that Jonathan recognized all too well, the same tone he had once used himself. Sharp, condescending, certain, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. This time, he did not stay silent, he did not let it pass as acceptable. Instead, he spoke with clarity and restraint, redirecting the conversation, highlighting the strength of her work, not exaggerating, not defending out of obligation, but acknowledging the truth of it, and in doing so, he shifted the entire dynamic of the room, not with force, but with respect. Sophie met his gaze briefly across the table, and there was something there, not surprise, not gratitude, but recognition, as if she was seeing the difference not in what he said, but in who he was becoming. Later that afternoon, as the office settled into its usual rhythm, Jonathan found himself standing at the edge of her desk once again, but this time, there was no hesitation, no hidden tension behind his words, only a quiet honesty that had taken him longer than he expected to reach. He told her that he had been wrong, not just in moments, but in the way he had approached people, that he had mistaken control for strength and distance for protection, and that in doing so, he had failed to see what truly mattered, and for the first time, there was no attempt to justify it, no attempt to soften the truth, just the weight of it, offered plainly. Sophie listened, her expression steady, and when she responded, her voice carried the same calm strength it always had, but there was a warmth there now, something that had not been present before. She said that change was not about words, it was about consistency, about showing up differently even when no one was watching, and that trust was not given. It was built, slowly, over time. Jonathan nodded, accepting that fully, not as a challenge, but as a direction, and instead of asking for anything in return, he simply said that he understood, that he would not expect anything he had not earned. As the day came to an end, the city lights began to glow once more.